Okay, welcome everybody, and thank you for joining the Lebanon Democrats Upper Valley Democrats program. We're very fortunate to have Scott Finn of VTPR presenting the future of local media. Scott has been involved in this ongoing conversation for many years. Prior to joining VTPR as its CEO and president in 2018, he spent many years building multi-news departments at WUSF in Tampa, Florida, as well as at WVPB in West Virginia. His teams at these stations won Edward R. Murrow and Peabody Awards under his leadership. He is also a nationally recognized reporter and was an award-winning reporter during his time with the Charleston Gazette in West Virginia. His experience at WVPB, a public radio and television station, positioned him to steer Vermont Public Radio's merger with Vermont PBS in July of 2021. At which time he became the combined entity's president and CEO. Peggy Williams, chair of the board of VTPR, has said of Scott, and I quote, "We have found in Scott Finn a forward-thinking and experienced leader. We are impressed with his extensive experience in the world of public media, his familiarity with rural communities, his engaging manner, and his authentic leadership style." After, end quote, after listening to Scott this evening, I think you will agree. And with that, turn it over to you, Scott.
Thank you, Lynn. Thank you, Nancy. And I appreciate you all taking the time to have this conversation. And I think it's really appropriate that folks in the media and folks that are in political and civic groups like this one are having more conversations because in a lot of ways, we do similar things. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Build trust, make sure that our democracy works. These are things that we may have taken for granted even 10 or 20 years ago that we now realize are things that need to be protected. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about the direct line that researchers have drawn between the decline of local media and some of the problems we're having with misinformation and loss of social trust. So, and then I'm going to give you a little bit of hope. It's not all hopeless. I see some really positive signs, especially here in New Hampshire and in Vermont. And then finally, I want to have some conversation at the end of this. So we'll have time for questions or comments. I'd love to hear more about how you interact with the media, what you think we ought to be doing more of, less of. I'll stick around for as much of that as we want. But like Lynn said, I've worked in journalism, but way before that, I grew up in a small town called Creston, Iowa, a little tiny place that's about 2 hours from the nearest shopping mall. And my dad was a mechanic, and my mom babysat other people's kids for a living. I was one of 5 kids. Neither my mom nor dad had gone to college. And so what we had, though, we had 3 things that helped all 5 of those kids go on to college and a successful career. And it was public schools, the public libraries, and public television. Each of those things had a huge impact on our lives. We had a good school system, well-funded, just like a lot of the schools in our region. We had a public library where we went every single day after school, and we did our homework, and we read, and we waited for mom and dad to get done at work so we could go home. And then public television. I'm 50, right? And so when I was growing up, this thing was relatively new. And when mom and dad put an antenna on top of our house, they got NBC and PBS, and that was it. But thank God we got PBS. We watched it all the time. Mr. Rogers and Sesame Street it opened up a whole other world, right? And you might remember that, or you might remember that for your kids.
Yes. So
important. And so, I actually, not only did I get to go to college, I ended up getting a scholarship, and I went to Harvard, which was a trip. If anyone else has been there, they'll know that. But I learned a lot. And then I went to the opposite of Harvard after I graduated, and that's called Big Ugly Creek, West Virginia. Big Ugly Creek is actually a small, beautiful place. But I served as a community organizer and a VISTA worker there for several years. Eventually became a journalist, and now I kind of combine the community organizing of being a VISTA volunteer with being a journalist in this job. My job now is trying to figure out how to make these journalism organizations sustainable. to make sure they have the resources and the money to be able to continue to do that really important work. So I have a question for you. And Nancy, I'm going to actually take back the thing about no questions. Feel free to open up or put the answer in chat. All right, question. In the last 20 years, I'm going to say Vermont, but the same number is true for New Hampshire, roughly. Vermont has lost what percentage of its journalists since the year 2000? Make a guess and then put it in the chat if you could. Just type your number. Sarah says 60%. 80% of our journalists, 25% of our journalists. How would you know this, right? 70%. It is about somewhere around 40 to 45%, depending on how you count journalists. So whoever said that, almost half, that's a lot in 20 years. And so even when you still have like your local newspaper, what you've noticed is that it's gotten thinner. You know, there's less in it. And, you know, a lot of the places that used to have like radio stations, individual local radio stations that used to have local news, a lot of them don't have it anymore. Even the TV stations, if you watch WCAX or PTZ or the other stations, you often see there's less local news and less in-depth local news than there was 20 years ago, and a lot more packages from outside of the region. So it's kind of a hollowing out. Now, that number, that 40% would actually be a lot lower, a lot worse, excuse me, if it had not been for the rise of several different institutions. And in Vermont, there have been basically three that 20 years ago either did not exist or did not have a very large news organization, and now they do. Again, and the Vermonters have a plus advantage here, but does anyone know what the three organizations are? Any of the three? Just open your mic and guess or put it in chat. The organizations have grown their newsrooms in the last 20 years. Digger. Digger did not exist 20 years ago, and now it has 20 journalists. All right, two more. New Hampshire Bulletin. Oh, okay, that's New Hampshire. That's good. I don't know those answers as well. Does anyone have another Vermont answer? I'll give you a hint. I'd really like to see this answer delivered. Valley News is holding on really well. An organization that has greatly expanded its news gathering capacity in the last 20 years. Yay, Valley News. I'll give you another hint. I work for this organization. VTPR! Hey, thank you, VTPR. Yes, VTPR had 3 journalists in 2000. And now we also have 20 journalists working for VTPR and Vermont PBS now that we're merged. We don't produce as much daily news because it takes a lot longer to do video and audio than it does to do text, but we have 20 people working in journalism. The other one is 7 Days. 7 Days is, for people who are not as familiar with it, it's mainly based in Burlington, and it used to be the weekly, and now they do a lot of daily news as well. Those organizations have really stepped up. And it sounds like, I know the folks at the Valley News. The Valley News is actually you're lucky to have one of the healthiest locally owned newspapers in America. Oh, hello. Where are the owners?
We should probably.
Hello. I don't know the owners. Hello, Nancy. How you doing?
Well, it's a family operation, and I mean, it has
been all my life, and I'm now 91.
And so it started. What your grandfather was 1870. Well, anyway, we purchased it though in the early 1980s. So
you all should be leading this conversation, not me.
No. We're I think the marriage between what you're talking about, which we are, as you can tell by our product, heartily endorsing. We are, we are doing everything possible for a digital outgrowth at this point. And the marriage between your assets and ours and everything else, we cover Western Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and this little portion of Vermont that the Valley News covers, and that's our with different newspapers. So anyway, keep going. I love it.
I'd love to talk to you after this meeting.
Sure.
I would love to do that because you're going to hear things that are going to be like, oh, we should be getting together.
Uh-huh.
You know, so I'll get back to local media. One of the failings, though, of VPR, Digger, and 7 Days in general is that we're not really getting to school board meetings, town, town meetings. We're not really covering local things. Definitely not high school sports. There's a lot of things we're not getting to at all. That the Valley News and other newspapers like that do for communities, and that's a problem. We have to help these newspapers to be able to continue to do that. But the loss of these reporters in the media, in the local media writ large, is in general leading to a loss of social trust. There's actually a lot of studies that show that if you go to the Pew Charitable Trust's annual poll, it shows that local media is much more trusted than national media. It kind of makes sense. I mean, people know you, Nancy. They know who you are. They walk down the street. If they don't like what you publish, they're going to tell you in person. And I get the same thing, and that's good because people feel like they can actually have some impact on local media. But the problem is, there are these anti-competitive factors at play, especially if we're trying to not have a paper be a local newspaper, but also having it be online, right? The problem with newspapers online is that it's harder to make money off of that. And the reason it's harder to make money off of online newspapers, it's not because people don't want the content. They do. They read it. It's because it's harder to make money off of that content because all of the revenue is being sucked up by these tech giants, the Googles and the Amazons, the Facebooks of the world, the Metas, whatever they call themselves now. They are sucking all the revenue out of local media systems and taking it up to themselves. So things that we used to be able to depend on are now going to Facebook Marketplace. And so this is the issue. People often think that, oh, newspapers are having trouble because people stopped caring about what they write about. That's not true. They're having trouble because other people have stolen the money out of the system, and we're trying to figure out how to replace it. So stolen is strong, but they've taken the money out of the system. All right. So the other thing local media does is that you're a watchdog. I used to cover in West Virginia, I covered the Putnam County School Board and the Putnam County Commission, which is kind of like a town council. And I was there every single meeting. And it's funny, the number of times people said that something did not happen because I was there. It was unfortunate, really, because I think my presence actually kept exciting things from happening. But actually, it's true. The fact that you have people that are watching government has an effect on its responsiveness to democracy and also a decline in corruption, frankly. People fear having their names in the paper, being accused of doing corrupt things. And again, corruption isn't a huge issue in New Hampshire and Vermont, although we've had our cases. But in West Virginia, where I'm from, and spent most of my adult life, it's a huge deal. And there are studies that show that in communities that have more local reporting, there is less corruption. And in communities that have a decline in local reporting, there's an increase in corruption. When people aren't being watched, they stick their hand in the cookie jar. It's human nature. So there's a danger here. I think in Vermont and New Hampshire, we have pretty good government, but if the watchdogs continue to decline, there's going to be more temptation for people to try to do things that you wouldn't imagine that they've tried before, in terms of all sorts of things that are either unethical or illegal. So, all right, this is the atmosphere that has allowed sort of this distrust and misinformation to thrive. So what are we going to do about it? Well, it's important, first of all, to remember, as you know better than I do, that these things don't occur in a vacuum. Misinformation, oh gosh, I was in West Virginia during the 2016 election. I had to get off of it, even though it was part of my job to kind of see what was going on, because the Facebook of West Virginia in 2016 was just toxic. It was full of racism and hate and fear. It was shocking. And how did that happen? Why was that happening? Well, it's happening in a context of in West Virginia at least, declining economies, people losing their jobs, a lot of addiction, you know, a lot of hopelessness that leads to political leaders, you know, coming up with scapegoats and making the media into the scapegoat. And they're looking for people to blame, you know, and sometimes we're a really easy target. Again, local media is trusted more than national media. And so when you have healthy local media, that counteracts some of the misinformation because they're more trusted. They're there in your community. But when you lose the local media and all your only interaction with media in your entire life is national media, it's more partisan, it's more combative, and it's farther away, that leads to people distrusting the media even more. So that's why local media is so important. Also, social media algorithms reward fear and extremism and division. So I was supposed to come up with solutions. I'm sorry, I went back into problem. I'll try to go back to solutions. There's one more thing. People like me and the media are often not the right people to be reaching out to the people that aren't paying attention to the media, younger people in particular, people of color, which, by the way, the population of BIPOC individuals in Vermont and New Hampshire is small, but growing very fast. And those folks do not feel, according to our surveys, do not feel well represented in our media. They're here in larger and larger numbers. They are, well, I'll ask, what percentage of Vermont right now is Black, Indigenous, or people of color? Non-white. According to the last census, does anyone know?
Isn't it about 1%? It's a
Nope,
very
higher.
small,
Higher than 1%.
it's higher than 1%.
I would say 4. Don is saying 10.
10's
10.
closer.
10's
11%.
11%. Good.
11% of Vermonters identify as other than white.
And are they concentrated around the Burlington area? They.
Largely, but not entirely. And I think actually the Upper Valley is another area that has more diversity than some other places in Vermont. And so that went from 5% of Vermonters 10 years ago to 11% today. It's actually one of the faster growing minority populations in the whole country.
Are you
When you look at it that way, and if it continues growing that way, the next census, it'll be more like 1 in 6 Vermonters will be a person of color. And also, yeah, New Hampshire very much so, but it sounds like more around the Boston suburbs. I've heard the same thing from my counterparts at New Hampshire Public Radio. They're very concerned about reaching, especially people who speak Spanish as a first or second language. It's a very fast growing community. We're not reaching very well. 15% of kids in school. So, you know, we had this image of Vermont and New Hampshire that is actually not entirely based in reality anymore. We're diversifying. It's happening. And so we need to have, at VPR, we have actually worked really hard to make sure that our staff represents our population. And so we've gone from having only 3% people of color on staff 2 years ago to 9% now. Our goal is to meet and then exceed that 11% goal and hopefully keep moving. Because if we want to reach that audience, you know, one of the things that we've heard in our studies is that, you know, they don't listen or watch us as much because they don't feel represented. They want to know that they are represented in our coverage and in our staff. Also, it helps to have a diverse staff because they will understand what the stories are from their lives and their interactions with people. So that's really important. Another group that we're trying to reach is, and this might be unpopular on this call, is political conservatives who still want fact-based journalism. They do exist, and I'm just joking, of course they exist. And they don't always feel represented on NPR and on PBS. And so we think that there are things we can do, including we did a big project with StoryCorps called One Small Step, which was basically just getting political conservatives and liberals together to talk about, usually not politics, to talk about their lives. We matched people that had something in common besides their politics. So for example, we matched 2 people that liberal and conservative, but they both lost their mother when they were children. And they talked about that. or we matched two people in at University of Vermont, a liberal and conservative woman, who actually were just really interested in getting outside their filter bubbles and meeting each other. It was a wonderful set of conversations. If you go to VTPR.org and search for One Small Step, you can see this for yourself. It's hard work. I felt like, we did a couple of dozen of these interviews, and every time we made a lot of progress with the people doing the interviews. There are 650,000 people in Vermont and more of them in New Hampshire. I don't know if we have time for 650,000 conversations, but that is a one small step toward maintaining civility and getting to know people outside of politics. And then you can talk a little bit about politics, and then it opens a door, as I'm sure when you're talking to your friends, neighbors, family members who are not Democrats, being able to make connections around other things opens a door to start talking about political issues. So that's another group that we're trying to reach. And the final group that we have some trouble reaching are people who do not have college degrees, which is still a majority of folks in both Vermont and New Hampshire, people with less than a 4-year degree or high school diploma. And my parents, that was my parents. My mom loved PBS. It was a window to the world. She's very curious, even though she never had a college degree. So I know that a lot of the stuff that we make are going to be interesting to people without college degrees. We just have to make sure we introduce it to them in a way that they know about it and is interesting to them. And I think, again, local journalism, local storytelling can engage people maybe that don't traditionally engage with the national stuff. One of the reasons that Vermont PBS and VPR has merged is because what we're hoping to do is, when you have a merger, you do save some money, your efficiencies. If you're doing that in a corporation, you take those efficiencies and you might give the stockholders money back. In a nonprofit, we're taking the efficiencies and we're going to reinvest them in new programming that tries to reach out to this broader and more diverse audience. So we can continue to serve our existing audience in the way that we've always expected, but then try to reach out to new audiences, mostly on digital streaming platforms with new programs and different services that hopefully appeal to them. Because, right now, about 45% of our primetime audience on radio and TV is 65 plus. So we love that. That's wonderful. Thank God for 65 plus supporters. And also, for our relevance, we need to also reach out to the younger people too. So we got to work on that. So anyway, thank you for having me here today. I'd be more than happy to listen to any of your ideas for stories. I'd love to hear more from anyone who has experience in the media industry as well, like you do. I'm open to any criticism of things you've heard or seen, and I'd be happy to take any questions as well. Thank you for having me.
We're sitting in South Carolina right now, so we don't have any story leads for you.
But I think it's fair to say that if you're going to be successful, I believe, in the low, in our business now, you owners have to operate like nonprofits. And I don't say that in any other way other than truth. And for so long as we can, as we're able to do that in the community, I mean, the Valley News is sustained so well, partly because the community responded, what was it, 2 or 3 years ago, to an appeal to the community for donations. And it was a remarkable response. I mean, it really moved us to tears at times. I mean, just we'd get the numbers. And it's because of the credibility I think we've built up over the years. And we were trying so hard not to, make cuts where everybody else required, we all had to make them. I mean, people felt they had to make them. So but I think now we find people are accustomed more to digital. And that's the problem with your demographic. We share that in the Valley News, but we have a younger demographic in some of our other papers. But that's the problem is I think we have to train people more on, or make the digital world more accessible to even more people and not assume they understand, right, Don?
Yeah.
Use our beta at 91. How to log on and stay on, why it benefits them. you know, what more coverage there is. It's just got to be more, we have to be more proactive. But that's from the standpoint.
Can I ask you a question? When you received those donations, those wonderful donations, were you able to make that tax deductible for them, or were they giving it to you without a tax benefit?
No tax benefit.
Well, I'm not sure, actually. That's a very good question. But Deb, you would have given, yeah.
I gave and promoted information, and there was no
I don't
tax
think,
deduction
I
that
don't
anybody spoke of.
yeah, I don't think it was a 501c3. We would have probably, only because it was kind of an emergency appeal, you know, in the sense of timing is everything.
There was, it was done through the Ground Truth Project.
Okay.
And I discovered when I did the second one that they sent me back a receipt saying this is for your tax purposes.
Okay, there you
And
go.
they seemed to think I should know that the first one would work too, but
Oh,
I'm sorry. It was, you know, we have a great staff that they handled all of it. So, I mean, great publisher and everything.
Well, the reason I ask is because I don't know if you saw where Paul and Rowdy, who own 7 Days, which is a for-profit publication that acts like a nonprofit. Paul and Rowdy recently wrote a column where she talks about they're in the middle of trying to set up a foundation in Vermont that would allow people to give donations, and those donations could go to this foundation and be tax exempt, but then they would go to your local newspaper for use for charitable purposes. So it couldn't be used for a party, but it could be used for, let's say, some sort of civic good, like covering the school board. So, you know, we're talking to them because one thing, we have a lot of experience with nonprofit journalism too. We're talking with them about how maybe we can help them do this, because it's in our benefit, it's our interest for there to be a healthy local news ecosystem.
Yeah.
So I would love to, I'll send you guys some information if you're interested about what they're trying to do. And it might be something you guys are interested in finding more out about.
We'll pass it on to her.
the
Very
two I was talking about were not the emergency one at the beginning, but on funding those 2 young reporters who are terrific.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. Yeah. And I don't know if VPR or public radio has a similar journalism. What do we call it?
Report for America.
Yeah, Report for America. Do they help you as well?
Yeah, we have a woman named Lexi Krupp, who is a Report for America fellow. And you guys have a couple?
Yeah, we have a couple up in the valley. We have them. We have newspapers in, like I mentioned, other places, and they've spread throughout our our domain. They're, you know, they have all that wonderful, exciting enthusiasm, and we've always taken it as a responsibility to train, you know, a reporter who gets so good we lose them in a year or two, and so it's kind of consistent with our DNA.
Well, I think Report for America is a good solution. Another solution which Congress failed to pass, which would have been in the Build Back Better Act, it would have been a tax credit for organizations like yours that hire reporters. And
hoping for that. Yeah.
That would have helped. And there's still a possibility that it could be added to some other bill someday. And so if you want to know politically what could be done to help, is to, you know, newspapers are a public good. You know, they should be able to get a tax credit for the journalism that they do. And a tax credit would be for every reporter they hired, they get some of that could be basically put against their tax bill.
Well,
it'd be really simple.
The biggest I mean, to me, the biggest target, we'll call it, is what you mentioned at the start, which is social media, Meta, Facebook, etc. And a large group of us, you know, have banded together on that effort right now, because it's fine to do all this stuff on the fringe, but we're still not getting that younger demographic unless we get strong enough that we can do everything to, you know, to communicate with them. So that means taking away something. I mean, and I think it's outrageous what these large operations have taken away from us. So.
Well, I think one thing that gives me a little bit of hope is that Vermonters and people in New England in general really do value their local institutions, and are willing. We did a VPR, Vermont PBS poll, and we asked people, are you willing to pay more money for your dairy products if you're supporting local farms? And the answer was overwhelmingly yes. I don't know if other states would. I don't think Florida, where I used to live, I don't think they would do that. Honestly, it is something very special. And so it gives me some hope that here, maybe we might be able to find some solutions.
Mhm.
Well, I've got to say, and then we're not going to talk anymore because I want to hear from the Vermont people and the New Hampshire people. But we live in the Savannah area of South Carolina. We live in South Carolina, but in the Low Country we call it. And we have an excellent newspaper. It's a McClatchy paper, and it's going through they're dealing with everything we've dealt
Yeah.
with. We're dealing with up there, but it has been more successful because we've had to accommodate foreign languages, and we are a 60-40 white black. I mean, race is a given here. It's not an issue, but our issue is much more immigration coming in, and so
Mexican.
yeah, mostly Mexican, but just immigration, and I hope more.
Mm.
I hope we have to have more languages that the paper has to communicate in. But McClatchy's put a lot of stuff in here, and again, the local story makes all the difference. But there's a lot of community support here, so we can have hope. It's and this is well, fairly broad, but it's obviously more conservative than Vermont. But there's a lot of support.
It's interesting. The desire for knowing what's going on in your community, knowing what's happening at the school board, knowing what's happening with the high school sports, all that's pretty universal, and it is one thing that brings people together across political divides.
All right, we're going to mute ourselves. We're going to listen.
Well, I want to see if people have other comments. I know this is not a shy group. I've heard from Lynn and other people. So
Yeah.
anyone else want to weigh in
And
on the video?
Lori Harding has something in
Yeah.
the chat.
Yeah.
What does it take for a newspaper to become a 501c3? I don't know if technically that's possible at all.
It is actually, but just recently. So for the longest time, the IRS would not want to hear it at all. But now it is possible. And basically it has to give up, but it's hard. Either the owners have to just give up their lifetime of investment, basically donate it to this new nonprofit, or the nonprofit has to have enough money to buy the owners out. I think, though, honestly, I don't know if nonprofit is necessary. As as the Dwights were saying, if you're a for-profit but you believe in your community and you act as a public service organization, you don't necessarily have to be a nonprofit to do great work. And what we're trying to figure out is there a way that you could give donations to the Valley News and other newspapers like that, and still get your tax benefit? And I think there are ways. I mean, it sounds like Ground Truth found a way when that happened the last time. But yeah, it is possible. You could, if the owners wanted to, you could end up giving the newspaper to 501c3. But I think what folks would tell you is that it still has to break even. You still have to find a way to get to that break even mark, even as a nonprofit. And that's the challenge. How does Daybreak affect? I don't know about the Valley News as much. For us, it's great that you have a more localized news source. And I've heard about Daybreak and I've read it a few times. I'm not super familiar. Do you find it to be fair to present all sides of the story? Is it a good journalistic organization?
I don't know if the question's being asked to me. I think that what they do is pick from a whole variety of things they think would be of interest to their readers. They don't necessarily go out and investigate stories or write stories as a result. And if they post something, it'll run the gamut from somebody's camera recording an owl at night to a story that they cut, and you have to get through the paywall at Valley News maybe to read it. So it's almost sort of like a poo-poo platter where you can spin it around and pick off of it what you want, but they definitely depend on other people to write the stories.
Well, that's the thing. So at the end of the day, you need that base. Somebody has to go to the regional school board meeting, or else you don't have all the people that are commenting and spinning and opinionating and here's something interesting. It has to start from a base of somebody who you trust telling you what really happened. I think Natalie,
Sue, Daybreak is local. It's a local person that does it.
I'm not quite sure what to tell you the truth, what Daybreak is for or what it's trying to do, because I'd say 8 times out of 10, I see something I saw in the Valley News 2 days ago. If I want, a cute animal video or whatever, as I say, I don't quite understand what it is. It's not really an aggregator. It's not a source of news that I can't get somewhere else. As you say, there's no reporter. So as I say, I don't know what it's for. I used to read it. I still get it. And I go, nah, half of the stuff and it's going to be in the Valley News anyway. And it's going to be in depth in the Valley News. There's going to be the whole article in the Valley News. Why do I want to read a summary in something else?
I would
Well-
say the one exception, and I am careful about this because I was a candidate. There were 8 candidates running for 4 seats in Hanover on the school board at the beginning of March. And there was no story about the candidates in the Valley News, but we didn't know that there wouldn't be. And a resident at Kendall, sent out a survey to all 8 candidates, compiled the information, and then she took it upon herself to send it to Daybreak, which printed it. And so I think in that instance, there were people who otherwise would not have had access to that information. So at least in that, but I think that depended on the fact that this individual at Kendall sent it to Daybreak. But otherwise, I would agree with you. It's sort of a fun thing.
Yeah.
It's got
I
music.
think Daybreak is an agglomerator. I think you wake up in the morning and it gives you the weather and it tells you what's new and what's happening that day at Dartmouth and at bookstores. It tells you what's going on in a one easy place. And if you don't want hard news, it shows you owls and bears. And if you want some music, it shows you some music. It's not a journalistic, it is an agglomerator of things that are going on, and he collects it. And I think it's very useful when you're in the mood. It can make your day or like that.
But it won't break your day.
No.
For instance, the picture of the white
Exactly.
cardinal,
Right.
it was joyful. It's
Right.
not all, it's not horrific, icky, oh my God, here
And
we
it
go
kept
again
you-
news.
But it
Yeah,
also
no, I-
kept you posted on COVID. It kept
Mhm.
all of us posted on COVID every day. How
Yeah.
many are there? And now it's Tuesdays and Fridays. And it's very helpful.
Well, I think, the thing about I kind of painted a picture of doom and gloom around digital, when in fact, it's really interesting. There's both decline and there's also 1,000 flowers blooming and different people trying different things. Some of it really, really effective. But one thing that's happening, and this isn't good or bad, it just is true. There's something that's disaggregation, disintermediation. A newspaper isn't just a delivery source for local news. It's an aggregator of national and international news. It tells you the sports scores. It has obituaries. It has personal ads perhaps, or it has hiring information. It has ads from your local businesses. I mean, some of the things a newspaper do have nothing to do with the news. And actually what we discovered is that some people who are used to be buying the paper were not really buying it for the news at all. They were buying it for the comics and the crossword and all these other things. What digital has done is it's taken all those things that were bundled up into your local newspaper and it's scattered them to the winds. Your puzzles and your cool photos and the announcements, everything is all over the place now instead of being in that one package. And that's, I'm not saying that's a good or bad thing, it just is. And so what newspapers are trying to do is saying, okay, the most profitable things for us have been stripped away a lot of times and taken by these outside forces. How can we make sure that the thing that everyone agrees is important for democracy and community, how do we continue doing that? And the answer to that is going to be, I think, philanthropy. It will be people being willing to put their subscription dollars or their annual donations or their sustaining memberships. Thank you, Deb, by the way. I saw that in your chat that you just made a donation to VTPR and Vermont PBS. Thank you. That's what's going to keep us going. And again, we're very fortunate in Vermont and also in New Hampshire. There is a huge degree of per capita giving to media going on already, and especially the public media. Look, VPR, how can I say it? We shouldn't exist. When we started 40 years ago, we were actually told by the national folks that there were not enough people in Vermont to sustain a public radio network. And now not only are we sustaining it, but there are 20 plus journalists, and then there are all sorts of other people that make it come to you, almost 100 employees. To put that in perspective, I worked at WUSF Tampa, Florida, which was a public TV and radio station. It served 4 million people. It had a staff of 50. So little tiny Vermont, there's so many people that are so generous, we can have a robust and healthy public radio and public TV network. So, and support VT Digger and support the Valley News. I mean, it's really amazing the level to which Vermonters in particular are willing to support. But we're just trying to figure out, it's not, how can I say it? There's a limit. So we also have to try to figure out how to be efficient. Yeah, Karen.
Thanks. So is VT Digger, this isn't my question, but you just said VT Digger, that's part of the family now?
Oh, no. They would be very upset if you left that impression. We are friends, but we're also competitors, which is a good thing. We actually still have journalistic competition in Vermont.
So I think one of the really interesting things that is happening, and we see this a lot in New Hampshire, particularly in our state legislature, is these national organizations, these think tanks that are active. They've really created essentially like a dark web, if you will, so that at the state level, at the state legislature level, there's almost copy and paste legislation that's being introduced. And I find that feels like a gap to me in some of the media coverage, because there is national attention of what's going on in DC. And then I think our state media does, a fairly good job of following what's going on, in Montpelier or in Concord. But the fact that, there's exactly the same legislation being introduced in New Hampshire as Texas, as Florida, is that, so I guess I'm offering that as a story. I don't know that that's happening in Vermont, but like, I'll just say, and the fact that, for example, the trans, yes, and I see Susan's talking about that's ALEC, and ALEC, but it's not just ALEC. Now it's like a lot more. There's actually a lot more of them, but the fact, and I guess my other point was that it's not just even at the state legislatures anymore, it's at the local level as well. And so that's why even in Hanover, the school board is having to deal with, kind of anti-trans, anti-queer, efforts. So I find that is an interesting area of kind of what are the shadow groups doing, and how can we see the totality of the work that they're doing?
Well, I think there's a direct line from the fact that there are fewer reporters, and even, I don't want to pick on anybody because I think the Valley News is great, but I think that they would agree there are fewer reporters there than there used to be. And it was easier, even back in the day when I started as a reporter 25 years ago, we still struggled to cover every school board meeting in our region, but we did a decent job. We were at least checking in on each and every school board. Now it's impossible. It's just a numbers game. You don't have enough people to attend all the meetings, and you kind of hope that you can triage and get to the ones that rise up and become really problematic. But when people don't understand who's running for school board, and some folks are not being honest about what their agenda is when they run, then you get a situation where folks sneak into the school board on one, because no one knows who they are. And then all of a sudden you have chaos, and you have people that are, propagating beliefs and ideas that people had no idea they're voting for. This is why we need to solve for local journalism. And we not only need to save what we have, but we need to build it back. because you need to have independent people going to these meetings and people that don't have their own agendas and who are willing to do a little research when someone says, I'm running for school board. Who is this person? But the trick is not only do you need to have someone doing it, but the someone doing it has to be trusted by the majority of the community. And that's also hard. So I'm not underestimating the challenge that we face that Karen's laying out, but I think it's imperative that we tackle it. And I see Deb and I see Madeline.
Well, I was just thinking, I was remembering this is decades ago, and my husband was a stringer for the Valley News, and he attended a Hanover school board meeting where they talked about lice, head lice in a number of cases. And he wrote an article that led with head lice in Hanover schools. And people were just outraged that, the Valley News was reporting on head lice. And we thought it was hilarious at the time. But so I think it would be wonderful we could bring back stringers. But I do think that letters to the editor are a really untouched area where people can bring that kind of attention to readership. But it's almost the readers have to step up and say, okay, I'll be the stringer for that local event and make sure that everybody else knows about it, instead of, how some people I think might imagine the letters to the editor.
Excellent. Madeline.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting because it seems like exactly one of the things that's missing is the stories that aren't getting into the paper because they can't be covered. And we were all told, remember at the beginning of the internet, it was going to be citizen journalism and how wonderful it was going to be. And it just ended up being people ranting on Facebook, when citizen journalism could be somebody going to the school board or whatever. I wanted to just mention one thing, and I don't know how this can be solved in some sort of practical sense, but I've noticed that there isn't one of the problems with the 2016 election was everybody said, oh, where did all this support from Trump come from? And, if the national newspapers had had better connections with the local newspapers, if there was more talking back and forth, or if, as there used to be, people's journalistic careers, you started in a small place and then you ended up at the New York Times or whatever. So you had these local contacts, because it seems to me that's missing as well. The Washington Post, are they coming to the Valley News to ask what's going on, what people are thinking in Hanover? Because I think if they had, there wouldn't have been this incredible surprise where these people, the people parachuting it in, having one coffee with the guy, the one gay gun supporter, whatever, trying to find the one person for whatever point it is that they want to make, which I think, again, adds to people's lack of trust with the national newspaper, because they feel it's just somebody who comes in and walks out and does their story and has no stake in the community, or he doesn't even bother to take the time to find out.
Well, I imagine a lot of people here have been in a story at some point, or the subject of a story. And they say the quickest way to lose your trust in a media organization is to be the subject of a story. Because, it's hard. I was a journalist. It's hard to get it right. And we don't always get 100% of it right. On top of that, even when we get it right, we might take a different take on it than you would have preferred or you thought was the right take. And that, that means that journalists aren't always super popular people, which also makes it really hard to make a case for them sometimes. But what they do, this idea that there's somebody, without fear or favor, trying to tell it like it is as best they can based on what they saw. That's an important value. And the issue with citizen journalists, it is what we have now in a lot of cases, and thank God for it. And yet, citizens have lives, and they don't always have good training. They don't always can make it to the meeting consistently, and they're not always trusted. And sometimes, they do have their own agendas too. So, that's the trick with that. Someone asked, I think it was Karen, like, do we have a letters to the editor on radio? Not per se. We did have at one point commentary, but that was kind of clunky and it wasn't working for us anymore. What we've done now, though, increasingly is we're doing journalism with people. And so, for example, we have a show and a podcast called Brave Little State, where we have a module where it goes out on social media and on email newsletters with questions that people are submitting. People get to pick between the 3 questions that they want answered. The one that gets the most votes is the one that we do a story on. And we often do that story with the question asker. So if Deb, if you submitted a question to us and it was picked, we would call you up and say, do you want to report this story with us? So that's one way that we're trying to respond to what the audience wants. And the stories are everything from why is that road called that name? That's one type of story we get. But it's also things like what would happen if Vermont funded its schools based on income taxes more than property taxes. And so we get all sorts of great questions that way. So that's our attempt to kind of interact and work with you as the audience to tell stories together. Also Vermont Edition, if you call in on Vermont Edition, that's sort of your letter to the editor. What is the result of our conversations with people with opposite beliefs? The one small step. I think one thing we learned is that building trust, it takes energy and time. And so, we had 2 full-time staff devoted to doing this for a whole, season, for all of fall. And if we're going to continue doing that, we're going to have to continue devoting resources to it. But we did discover that people, once they got together and they started talking to each other, super easy to make friendships. It didn't take much. And that once they made the friendship, they were okay talking about politics too. It had to happen in that order. Willingness to come together, make a friendship, then talk politics. And they didn't change each other's minds, by the way. I didn't see any of that. But I saw a lot more like respect for each other at the end of the process. But I think the thing that is still to be discovered is whether it had any effect on our audience, 1. And 2, whether we're going to be able to get people who aren't already listening by doing things like one small step. Could we get people who could consider themselves more politically conservative to listen more often? I will say this, what percentage of NPR listeners nationwide consider themselves politically conservative? You want to make a guess? And then the population, by the way, I think the population is like 40%, 40 some percent. Deb, you're good. Yeah, 25% of NPR listeners nationwide self-identify as conservative. So we do reach a lot of conservatives. When I was in West Virginia in the legislature, I would cover the legislature. I would cover the Republicans that run the legislature there. And they would pull me aside after the interview and they'd say, Scott, I'll deny it if you ever tell anybody this, but I listen to you all the time. And so, I'm like, okay, I'll take it. I'd rather you admit that we're a good news source that you depend on. But, unfortunately, culturally, people have tried to make these divisions about who listens to public radio and who doesn't. But my experience is it's a lot more diverse than you might think.
Scott, do you have anything, thinking of public commentary, do you have anything like Maine calling on MPBN? Are you familiar with that?
Yeah, I think it's Vermont Edition would be the analogy to that.
Okay. Yeah.
I love Maine calling. And Maine and New Hampshire Public Radio and us, we're all really good buds. We share content back and forth. What do you like about Maine calling?
Well, I lived in Maine for over 15 years, northern Maine, and really the only thing worth listening to up there was Maine Public. And I really like Jennifer Rooks. She came from CBS, Bangor CBS station. And she found her home there at PBS. And she just, brought people in who experts or people involved in something, and they would make a presentation, and then she'd take calls. And just about anything was fair game. I mean, obviously you have certain FTC rules, but generally I never saw anything offensive on that program, and it was really enlightening to see the spectrum of opinion.
I really love Vermont Edition. So every day from noon until 1, we have these topics. We open the phone. The calls are fascinating, and I remember after Joe Biden was called, the race was called for Joe Biden, or it was official. It was like a Saturday. You all probably remember that. We just opened the phones on that Saturday afternoon, all afternoon, and took calls because people wanted to talk. And we had not one, but 2 teenagers call in and want to be heard. They hadn't even voted. But they wanted to be on the record in the moment of saying, I'm here, this happened, this is what I think about it. And that was really encouraging to me because we do struggle to get teenagers to listen. But when it's important enough to them and when they can be involved in it and engaged in it, they'll participate. And I've already got my hour, so I do appreciate. But I saw Nancy. Did you guys have your hand up? Did you have I think we should give the newspaper owners a closing
Well,
statement.
it's actually, I was on WBUR in Boston for a while doing the Republican side of a 2-person Republican Democrat weekly. Magna Chakravarty was our talent in those days because she was local, and it was called Radio Boston, and it was a call-in show. And what struck us constantly was the number of conservatives, and they weren't programmed conservatives, they were people, and they would harangue me often because I would be insulting to my own party, we'll put it that way. This was in 2012, it's a long time ago, before Trump. And it just struck me, and we went into that, or the station went into that point. I just wanted to talk about what you just said about conservatives. And there are a lot of conservatives who listen to public radio because they are looking for the truth. The second example I have is from today when I had to take some paint to our dump to legally and correctly dispose of it. And when I went around and showed my decal on my phone to indicate that I was indeed a resident, our check-in guy there, who was probably 70 years old and no doubt would have voted conservative, was listening to South Carolina Public Radio. In fact, it was kind of like a resident. My car was listening to it. His thing was listening to it. And I said, and he said, yeah, I listen to it every day. I get the news here, and he clearly would have voted for Trump. So I just think we have to make sure we don't stay in our little places. And I think that's what the Valley News is often trying to do. The third thing I'll say is, and that's why I had my hand raised, the importance of editors. That's, if there's anything we all know in the news business, it's we're good, you're good. The Vermont PR and BUR was good because editors and producers in that case could make sure it was accurate. Valid news was going out. So just wanted to make that point. And that's what you pay for, is those salaries. So.
Thank you so much for having me and a whole hour of your time to this. And thank you for supporting wherever it is and whatever, ones you use, local media. It's really important. I don't take you for granted. Neither do folks like the Valley News or Digger or the other institutions in New Hampshire. I mean, it's just vital. It is like voting rights, having a base level of trusted local media is really important to keep democracy alive. So thank you for everything. And thank you for having me here, Lynn. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Scott. This was a little bit scary, but I found it very inspiring toward the end, which is the way you want it. I think we would all wish you great success with the new organization and keep moving forward and inspiring others. Thank you very much.
Take care, y'all.
Thanks, everybody.